Hello, good afternoon, Fáilte Road. You're all very welcome this afternoon to our webinar. David Rouse is my name, advisor on multi-unit developments with the Housing Agency. Happy Bloomsday to you all. A Bloomsday, no doubt, like no other for everyone. Extraordinary times. We hope you're all keeping safe and well. Joined today by our panelist, Mairéad Phelan. I'll introduce Mairéad in more detail later on. In the background, on technical support are my colleagues Katrina Lawler and Mary Coffey. So thank you very much to Katrina and to Mary for their assistance. Also thanks to Sinead Quinn Phillips and DQO in Engineers Ireland for their background help and assistance in preparing this afternoon's webinar. I'm going to share my screen now and put up some slides here for you, and we will go through our administration, if you like, or our timetable for this afternoon. So I'm going to run a quick poll very shortly, and I'm going to do an introduction, some scene setting, and some news on the sector for multi-unit developments, owners, management companies with the theme of sustainable apartment buildings. Then I'll hand over to Mairéad for her session, which should last about 20 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, and we'll do a poll at the end and wrap up and close. We hope that you'll stick with us for the 40 minutes. We do commit to keeping to time, and with that, just in terms of our housekeeping, as you know, you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. We have a Q&A function, and we'd be grateful if you could input your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please use the chat function for technical problems if you're having a difficulty hearing or seeing something, and Katrina and Mary will pick up on those messages in the background and answer them for you. But please reserve the Q&A function for Q&As. We will record this. We are recording this for future use, and we will make the recording available to you. We have a huge number of people. We're in fact oversubscribed today, so we will be circulating this. So if any of your colleagues haven't managed to register, or any of your contacts haven't managed to register, we can send them out a link to the recording. For all queries in relation to this session, in relation to the slides or in relation to anything else, please contact us via mud@housingagency.ie. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and I'm going to run our first poll. And really this poll is just to get a sense of our audience. So we have a very diverse audience from the engineering sector, from multi-unit development owners, from architects indeed. I know some of the other professional bodies have shared this information. So we'd be grateful if you could just let us know. And again, this poll and our poll later on are entirely anonymous, so we don't know how you vote. And as I say, it's just for background information and to get a sense of our audience. And please apply the category that fits you best. So you may be an engineer and you may be in a local authority, but go with local authority staff on that one. So we'd be grateful for your background on that. And I'm only going to run this for another 10 seconds or so, and we'll move on then to the next stage of our presentation. But again, thank you all for joining us. It's important to say that our comments this afternoon are very much general in nature and by way of information and guidance, and in relation to, I suppose, more technical, case-specific circumstances, you should contact your property professional, be it your engineer, your QS, your management agent, or your solicitor, as appropriate for individual queries. So look, I'm going to end that poll now, and I note that we have a lot of attendees from the architecture sector, so maybe that was an unexpected pleasure to have you with us. So thank you very much indeed, and we're grateful for your attendance as well. So I'm going to end that poll, and I can share the results with you now, and you can see the profile of people with us. So thank you very much indeed, and we're going to move on. I'm going to go back and share my screen now and share with you my own slides in terms of the running order for this afternoon. And if we can get that to move on, I will Good stuff. So a little bit about the housing agency and who we are. For those of you who don't know us, we are an agency under the aegis of the Department of Housing, Planning, Local Government. That's our offices, which I certainly haven't seen since mid-March under the circumstances. We work with the department, with local authorities, with approved housing bodies and other stakeholders in the sector. And our ethos and our vision, our mission is to promote the building of sustainable communities. And that's why we're sharing information and sharing as part of our training role and training function this session with you this afternoon. Our presenters, again, very grateful to Mairéad Phelan, who is head of the National Building Control Office, and Mairéad is a chartered engineer and a fellow of Engineers Ireland. Again, we're grateful to Engineers Ireland for their collaboration. I think collaboration between sectors and stakeholders across this period has been very productive and very welcome. So thank you to Mairéad for her availability today. Any comments, of course, today should be very much couched in the context of the current pandemic. We are at stage 2, as you know, and all information in relation to health guidelines and so on is available from gov.ie. What is the future for multi-unit developments and for high-density accommodation? Well, this particular slide is reflects New York's housing profile over the period from 1800 to 1850. And as you can see, there are various different public health incidences, epidemics over the period, and the sad deaths associated with them. And I suppose what we're saying here, the point to be made here is that over history, cities and high-density residential areas have persisted despite public health difficulties over time. The population of New York has rapidly expanded over that period despite the public health issues, and I suppose the memory of society is maybe forgets sometimes that the public health system does actually get on top of these difficulties over time, and the future for cities and for residential accommodation of a high density nature is likely to be continuing in that sense. That particular slide is taken from Ed Glasser's Triumph of the City. Many of you will be familiar with it. And another publication that might be of interest is from Hazel Easthope of the University of New South Wales, The Politics and Practices of Apartment Living. You might be interested in reading those. So where are we in the country in terms of numbers? Very quickly, Census 2016 tells us that there are about 172,000 apartments in purpose-built flats or blocks. And in terms of the profile, the CSO just last week issued some new data, very timely, in terms of the construction, or rather the grant of planning permission of apartments over the period from 2001 to 2019. And apartments is the green line, and you can see it is just very recently outpaced housing as a housing typology. Conventional housing is a housing typology over the period. Just in more recent times, the planning trends in terms of grants of planning permission over the last, say, 2 years, you can see the orange line is apartments. Some more detail on a deeper dig on the grants over that period. You can see the fine detail over quarters prepared by the CSO, and even more recently comparing Q1 2020 with Q1 2019, you can see a massive increase in the grants of planning permission over that period. And the CSO have a good table there, which shows, unsurprisingly, the concentration of grants of planning permissions for new apartments by region. As I say, unsurprisingly, the prevalence is in the Dublin area. So that's grants of planning permission. In terms of completions, different profile of numbers, quite obviously. This compares Q1 2019 with Q1 2020, and you can see the actual new dwelling completions for apartments is up 75% in that period. So again, that's just some background for you. This is the, I suppose, slide that tries to demonstrate all the different actors and players in the sector in terms of multi-unit developments and owners management companies. And we're going to focus on the actors, if you like, in the red box in the center. Other webinars we've held, which are available on our website, have dealt with other facets of the sector, and we'd invite you to access those. In terms of owners management companies, what are the trends? What's the data showing us? It's showing us that from CRO incorporation documentation, we know that on average over the last 5 years, 3 new owners management companies have been incorporated every week. And these are the statistics over the last, this is the raw data actually over the last over the last number of months. Even over the period of the pandemic, we can see that a vast number of owners management companies have been registered from February up to early June. So again, this is setting the scene, the context, the background. We know from the data, both from the planning, from the completions, from the Companies Office, that the sector is growing at a pace. So moving on then to some, I suppose, more detailed policy and regulation aspects. We have the apartment planning guidelines, and I know Mairéad is going to dig deeper into these in her presentation. These were produced in March 2018, and really the focus in the context of this presentation is around building life cycle reports and sustainable apartment buildings in terms of construction and joining up the thinking across into management and operation and the costs in terms of running an operation and in terms of replacement and long-term provision. They're framed in the context of apartment planning guidelines, and it is a requirement that all new apartment developments comply with the MUD Act in terms of planning authorities and their involvement in the approvals. They must take cognizance and require that the building life cycle report, as the last bullet point is on our previous slide, that the building life cycle report is there so that the residents know and have an idea of what the costs of running the scheme are going to be. So that's just to touch and highlight those particular guidelines, and Mairéad, as I say, will dig deeper into them. From a practical side of things, what are we talking about? We want to, I suppose, understand for all parties in the sector, be that from the engineering side, the architectural side, QSs, potential purchasers, solicitors, must be conscious over time of what the home is actually going to cost to run both the individual unit and then the common areas in terms of the service charge for the owner's management company. And on screen here, we have a sample budget for an owner's management company of 142 apartments, and magically the service charge budget for this particular development comes out at €142,000. So €1,000 per unit. Now, the rigor and the robustness behind a number of these calculations, I suppose it's food for thought, really, and people need to maybe reflect on a reality check. In this particular budget, the block insurance for a scheme of 142 apartments is set at €9,000, which I suspect is certainly on the low side, to say the least of it. So that's in terms of the ongoing running costs that people need to be conscious of under the apartment planning guidelines. In terms of the sinking funds and replacement of the building in the long run, here's a sample building investment fund or sinking fund calculation. And I'm not going to go through all of this. This is just to show you the composition of a building investment fund. And the Multi-Unit Development Act, which is the primary piece of legislation referring to owners management companies, says that each scheme must set aside €200 or such other amount per unit per annum. This particular example is a block of 40 apartments. And if we were to take the total accumulated or the total reinstatement cost from a sinking fund point of view, that particular estate would come up with about €600,000 in terms of its building components. For 40 apartments, run that over a lifespan of 25 years. And again, some components will last 40 years, some components will last 5 years. That comes up with a rough back of the envelope sinking fund contribution requirement of €558 per apartment per annum. So again, contrast that with the requirement of the MUD Act, and there is certainly a gap there, and we're trying to, I suppose, elevate the conversation and point out to people that some more thinking and some more rigor, I suppose, needs to go into the calculations behind all that. The Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland prepared a fantastic publication analysing the detail around sinking funds, and that's available on their website. And really, I suppose, to draw out the key point here is that there is a considerable under-provision in existing multi-unit developments that they surveyed, and their work and their analysis of the sector was a very representative sample of apartments around the country. And really, I suppose, what it drew out is that 86% of the multi-unit development surveyed had not prepared a building investment or sinking fund report. So really, they're in the dark as to the future costs of their development in terms of lifts and plant and machinery and roofs and so on. So worth thinking about that, I suppose. From the housing agency's point of view, we have a lot of resources to support OMCs and multi-unit developments on our website, and we'd invite you to look at that and visit previous webinars. They cover the financial side, the corporate governance side, really training and information for all stakeholders in the sector. It is now a year since our report on owners management companies, and we'd invite you, if you haven't seen it, to check it out on our website. And we've undertaken some writing on the sector. We will be producing later this week some guidance for owners management companies and multi-unit developments on the COVID situation, and it really is some suggestions and ideas and maybe guides for stakeholders in the sector. We're very grateful for the collaboration of the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland and the Institute of Professional Auctioneers and Valuers Ireland for their collaboration on that. Our next webinar is on the 1st of July, and that is with the Chartered Governance Institute, the ICSA, and that will focus on corporate governance for practitioners and stakeholders. So really the company law side of things in terms of the practicalities of filings with the CRO, managing AGMs, managing directors' duties, all the information around that. So we'd invite you to join us for that. A quick sector update in terms of the programme for government, just to put it out there for you, the content in relation to this particular sector and the things we're talking about. You can look that up for yourselves, but really just to show you the content that has been produced yesterday on that. So look, that's enough from me. You can contact us at mud@housingagency.ie. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand over to Mairéad, and I'm going to get her slides up on the screen, and hopefully the technology will cooperate with us on all of that. And conscious equally that while our OMC report is a year old, also conscious that last weekend marked the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell fire as well. So there is context to all of this, and we're not deaf to that. So look, I'll hand over to Mairéad, and the floor is yours, Mairéad, and I'll mute myself.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, David, for inviting me to speak on apartments and multi-unit developments. And multi-units being developments over 5 units that have shared common areas. I just saw a question there on it. In the context of long-term upkeep and maintenance costs. Life cycle strategic management, or life cycle costing, is important in the terms of the circular economy, sustainability, carbon emissions, and reduction initiatives. So it can be defined as the total cost throughout the building life and include planning, design, acquisition, maintenance, support, refurbishment, end-of-life deconstruction, disposal, and any other costs directly associated or attributable to owning or using that asset. So research by the Building Performance Institute in Europe indicates that 50% of buildings built before 1975 will still be in use in 2050. So how we live, work and play in our buildings today in 2020 is quite different to how we lived, worked and played 50 to 100 years ago. And we're also living longer. So when we deliver new housing, we're not really just housing this generation, we're also housing the next 2 generations. So we really need to think in terms of policies and strategies that encourage sustainable, continuous and adaptive reuse of our building stock, which enables buildings to suit new uses and conditions. Reuse of existing materials is important consideration at design stage. For example, if we look at, say, lead and zinc roofs have a 60-year lifespan and are completely recyclable. So we're designing for people who live in buildings. And in the next 15 minutes, next slide, David, I'll give an update on the National Building Control Office and talk about the issues for apartments and multi-unit developments in the context of building standards, sustainability, design aspects, life cycle reports under the March 2018 apartment planning guidelines. So the National Building Control Office is managed by Dublin City Council on behalf of the 31 building control authorities, and that's on the next slide, David, to promote a culture of compliance with the building regulations. We do this through a programme of education, training, inspections, providing compliance support to building control authorities, builders and owners and designers in relation to buildings. Our Building Control Administration System, that's the BCMS, has 120,000 registered users. So as building control authorities are also market surveillance authorities under the EU construction products regulations, and Brexit is now back on the table, the office is preparing to undertake a national market surveillance role for construction products. So we're located at number 3 Palace Street, that's us there, that's our building there on the slide. And as at the request of Dublin City Manager, Chief Executive Owen Keegan, he requested the office of the 21st century. So we operate as a paperless dynamic work environment with all office systems designed to be highly mobile. So the office can operate from anywhere. And since COVID-19 lockdown, it has been business as usual for us. So our contact is support@nbco.gov.ie. So the next one is the first frequently asked question on our webpage, and it brings us through the planning, build, occupy, and respond stage in the context of the physical infrastructure. Understanding buildings requires a detailed knowledge of how buildings are constructed, used, occupied, and maintained, and the various mechanisms by which their structural, material, and environmental conditions can be affected. It is important to note that no one profession or academic discipline has a monopoly over the built environment. It's an interdisciplinary field, which requires addressing planning, design, acquisition, maintenance, support, refurbishment, end-of-life, deconstruction, and disposal. But we need to go one step further, as set out in the UN Habitat paper on sustainable housing for sustainable cities. And in this slide, we look at, next slide, whole life cycle from cradle to grave design for all housing projects as set out in table 2. The provision of affordable and adequate housing is a key priority for all governments. Sustainable housing requires that the physical, social, cultural, environmental, climate change, economic facets, use and reuse over time of housing are addressed in an integrated policy. The barriers to reuse of existing housing include a perception of increased maintenance costs, building regulations, and the inherent risk and uncertainty associated with older building stock. Addressing buildings' adaptive reuse significantly reduces whole life costs, waste, and leads to the improved building functionality. If you look at the Departments of Housing, Planning and Local Governance Manual outlines and the approach to the design and methodology for bringing back homes, and it's a very useful guide to assist in the redesign and reuse of town centre buildings, and I would highly recommend it. The purpose of building regulations in the next slide is in a civilized society is for health, safety of the citizen and the protection of the environment. So this slide then is a visual representation of the building legislative framework in which building control officers work and operate. The legislation encompasses a holistic approach to provide for safe, accessible, durable, and sustainable buildings where occupants can be assured of a proper supply of air, light, thermal comfort, and water. The design and construction of buildings in Ireland is regulated under the Building Control Acts 1990 to 2014. And the 1990 Act provides for, amongst other things, the making of building regulations, which are the design requirements of buildings, and the making of building control regulations, which are for administration and ensuring compliances with the building regulations. So the next slide, property has its duties as well as its rights. To neglect of those duties in times past is mainly to be ascribed that diseased state of society in which such crimes take their rise. This is a very enlightened statement in response by Thomas Drummond, public official engineer in 1838, to landlords calling for the suppression of crime, where he condemned the manner in which Irish landlords generally neglected their duties to their tenants. So this statue is beside our offices in Dublin City Hall. And we need to remember that a house is just not a roof over one's head, but as Le Corbusier says, it's a house is a machine for living in. So for multi-units, legislators, planners, designers, occupiers, owners, management companies, builders, developers have a collective duties and individual duties and rights. So the building regulations provide for the administrative requirements of buildings, with the BCMS, that's the Building Control Management System, as the preferred means of building control administration in Ireland. And this enables the online submissions of commencement notices and certificates of compliances on completion and a register of building control activity. The online applications now for fire safety certificates and disability access certificates and dispensations relaxations will be enabled in the next couple of weeks. Building regulations, next slide, are a set of legal requirements for the design and construction of new buildings, extensions, material alterations, renovations, refurbishments, and certain changes of use of existing buildings. They are set out in 12 parts, and they primarily provide for health, safety, and welfare of people in or about buildings, for conservation of fuel and energy, and for access for people with disabilities. So a holistic approach to the design of buildings is what the building regulations provide. So for the next slide, it is important to note that the responsibility for compliance with the building regulations rests with the designers who design, build, and the builders who construct, and the owners who normally start the process. So all works must be designed and constructed in compliance with the building regulations. And just a quick run through the building regulations. Part A. A building must be designed and constructed on proper foundations so that it doesn't crack, move, or fall down. Building elements must be designed to resist large forces of loading, such as people, machines, accidents, earthquakes, rain, snow, for its lifetime, and that also includes balconies. Part B is fire, and buildings must have fire detection and alarm systems, a safe place of refuge for people to escape, walls with resistance to fire spread and access for fire brigade. Multi-units should have fire doors, which must be kept closed, and a fire should be contained in a room or the unit where it started for a specified period to allow people to escape. Part C, site preparation and resistance to moisture. We must build on a clean site free from contaminants, such as radon. The floors, the walls, the roof must be weather resistant and prevent the passage of moisture to the inside of the building. Part D, very important part, materials and workmanship. Buildings must be built in a workmanlike manner with proper materials which are fit for the use for which they are intended and for the conditions in which they are to be used. Materials fit for use in Scandinavia or Poland may not be fit for use here due to the different climatic conditions. Likewise, materials used in inland conditions may not be suitable for use in coastal or exposed regions of this country. Construction materials should be properly CE marked and have a declaration of performance. Part E is sound. Walls and floors must have a reasonable resistance to airborne and impact sound. In multi-units, it's very important to get this correct. You should not be able to hear your neighbours. For new multi-units, sound insulation performance tests carried out by certified testers should be available. And the type of floor coverings permitted is also very important here. Part F is ventilation, and ventilation must be provided for people in buildings, which limits the moisture content of the air to prevent condensation and mold growth. Proper supply of clean air into the building while expelling the stale air. Part G refers to hygiene. A building must have a bathroom, hot and cold water with properly insulated storage and service pipes. Part H, drainage and wastewater disposal, provides for the separate drainage for foul and surface water that doesn't cause a safety or pollution risk. The treatment system design must provide that its function to a sufficient standard for the protection of health in the event of a system failure. Part J, heat producing appliances, provides for the safe discharge of combustion products via flues or chimneys, and oil storage areas must be safely located and bundled. Part J in the next slide also provides for carbon monoxide alarms and detection system. A durable notice with operation and maintenance information must be fixed on or near all new replacement hearths, fireplaces, flues or chimneys. Part K, stairways, ladders and ramps. Building users must have a safe passage with guards on floors, balconies, roofs and vehicle ramps to provide for protection from falling as well as falling objects. Part L relates to conservation of fuel and energy, and it provides for nearly zero energy buildings. That is, energy efficient buildings by limiting the energy required for the building operation and associated carbon dioxide emissions. So it limits heat loss from the buildings and ensures heat gains from renewables. 30 years ago, insulation was considered a luxury. Now it's an absolute necessity and a requirement to mitigate against the negative effects of climate change and ensure affordable thermal comfort in our buildings. Thermal poverty is a serious issue across the whole of Europe. Part M is access and use, and it's really an equality measure and ensures people can access and use a building and its facilities and its environs, extensions, including its sanitary facilities. So that's part A to M. So construction products should be clearly marked and have a declaration. A building actually for sale or letting must have a building energy rating. So all buildings must have building energy rating, and buildings should have a form of, public buildings should have a form of display energy certificate. Construction products should be clearly CE marked and have a declaration of performance drawn up by the manufacturer. For multi-units, it's recommended that a complete categorized schedule of all building products should be available with their CE markings, their declaration of performance, certification, and test results. For example, this should be available for every brick, blocks, insulation, roof materials, vents, fire doors, railings, windows, cladding, intromescent paints, etc. So on our next slide, we hear a lot of discussion in the media and elsewhere regarding the costs of compliance with building regulations. But we do have to remember that the purpose of the regulations is to ensure health, safety, and welfare of people in or about buildings, conservation of fuel and energy, and access for all. So I would ask the question, which part from A to M that we have looked at there can we afford to relax or dispense with when we build our multi-units or any building? We do have these buildings for 60 plus years. So sustainable urban design standards for new apartment buildings requires a life cycle report to be included as part of the planning application to ensure certainty regarding the effective and appropriately resourced short and long-term maintenance and running costs. It also requires that the conditions must include a condition that requires compliance with the MUDS Act, establishment over an owner management company, and establishment and maintenance of a sinking fund for ongoing maintenance and renewal. So those who produce life cycle reports need to be clear on what is meant by lifespan and differentiate between design life, estimated design life, service life, predicted service life, estimated service life in the context of the durability of the construction products. Many of these life cycle reports that I've read use the term life expectancy with high-level statements that doesn't really have sufficient detail to assess long-term running and maintenance costs. Also, as so many variables change during construction and from the time difference between planning and occupation, the life cycle report should really be a preliminary life cycle report at planning, with the final life cycle report forming part of the Planning and MUDS Act compliances. Schedule 3 of the MUDS Act lists the documentation to be handed over to the owner management company, which includes compliance with the relevant planning permissions, building regulations, design and building control regulations, the paperwork, that's the commencement notices, the proper certificates of compliance on completion, disability access certificates and fire safety certificates. You must hand over the safety file as constructed drawings of structures and services, operational and maintenance manuals, warranties and guarantees, test records for drainage, water and heating systems, a schedule of plant, equipment and fire protection systems specifying the expected useful life of such plant, equipment and systems. And it would be very interesting to just look at the complete record for each multi-unit that is handed over. So in the preparation of life cycle reports, the design life of the building should be defined in the initial brief, and this should reflect the overall development requirement. Design life categories for building products or elements should be clearly specified with effects of failure and consequences of failure on the building itself and on the occupants. So a time frame really for repair or replacement, including occupant disturbance. For example, repairing a flat roof after 15 years of service, will the building have to be surrounded in scaffolding, and for how long? A lift out of order in a 3-story building has less severe consequences than a lift out of order in a 7-story building. So the design life or reference service life of all assets components should be specified in years and categorized with all of their associated compliances. Competent. It is important that a competent, you think you move on there, David, competent persons are involved in the design, construction and maintenance. And that's a person having sufficient training, experience and knowledge appropriate to the nature of the work to be undertaken. Competent is defined under the building control regulations, and it's quite a useful definition. So the quality of our built environment on health outcomes of people is well researched. People spend more than 90% of their lives indoors. We should note that the vulnerable, who are babies, the sick, elderly, poor, unemployed, and all of us during COVID-19 spend up to 98% of our lives indoors. So many health problems are either directly or indirectly related to the building itself. So it's very important that buildings are fit for purpose, constructed with proper materials, fit for the intended use and the conditions and the location that they are in. So building regulations, they provide for the health, safety and welfare of people in or about buildings, conservation of fuel and energy, and for access for people with disabilities. So for multi-unit developments, compliance with Part A to Part M of the building regulations should be available, and it should be absolutely mandatory as part of the documentation. So we must remember that when we build today, we will not only have consequences for this generation, but the next, and probably the next generation after that. So therefore, we must put people first by ensuring proper planning and sustainable development, providing for a quality built environment where people can live, work and play. So this really does require a very serious commitment to life cycle design, a serious commitment to ensuring full compliance with planning, building control and the MUDS Act for all apartments and multi-units. We do need to think of the future and the legacy we leave after us, and we need to be quite aware that we should actually have proper air, light, heat, water, thermal comfort in the buildings that we are providing for ourselves today. Thank you, David.
Fantastic, Mairéad. Thank you very, very much for that extremely detailed presentation. And I'm conscious for our audience that there's a huge richness and depth of information in what you've delivered. And so we will send out the slides to people. We will, if you send us an email in, and the recording will be available for future use. We're very limited now in our time, and we're going to endeavour to broadly stick to our timetable. We have a second poll that we might just run before we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to launch that now, and you might let us know what topics out of perhaps the density of information that we have delivered just now you might like to hear more about in the future. So the apartment planning guidelines, sinking funds, building insurance, fire safety, building regulations or standards, or something else. As I said, this is an anonymous poll, so please feel free to submit your opinions on it without fettering or without worrying about anonymity. So delighted to contact to hear your views on that. Just to remind you that you can send us an email to mud@housingagency.ie for any questions we don't get to after this. I'm sure Mairéad would be delighted to help with any specific questions that come through as well. So I'm going to end that polling. Thank you for your feedback on that. And so apartment planning guidelines come out top just at 30%. So we'll take on board that particular feedback. I'm going to switch very quickly to a couple of questions that we received in earlier. So one is in relation to leaks from apartments and water issues, and Mairéad has received that question. So I think the answer is really on the design side, isn't that right, Mairéad?
Well, I would say that, as I said, that buildings have to be fit for purpose, for the use that they are intended for. So we do need to see who's going to be using these buildings, who's going to be living in these buildings, and what are they going to be used for. So if I'm designing a bathroom, yes, I have water. So it should be designed that water does not leak into the building. Water can't get into the fabric of the building. So if I need tanking, my design requires tanking, it should be there. If it requires special sealants, different pipes, whatever, that's a design thing at the very beginning, and we are designing for the life of that building, not to leak when you move in 5 years later or 1 year later. A building should not have any leaks, cracks, or anything like that. And they're not even snags, they're just bad design. So we need a commitment to good design, is what I'm saying.
Another one for you, Mairéad. How do you get information on CE markings for building components for older buildings?
Okay, sorry, I'm just going to clarify one when I say bad design. Bad design and it could be very good design and bad construction. So I just clarify that one just in case anybody has, just to make sure that. So it's both design and construction. The CE markings, nothing should be available. Every construction product that has a harmonized standard should not be placed on the market without a CE marking on it. So whoever supplied that product should have that piece of paperwork and be able to give it to you.
Okay, thank you for that. A question in, has the building life cycle report been mandatory since 2018? Well, it's the 2018 guidelines are the first time that building life cycle reports were mentioned in the apartment planning guidelines. It was that iteration of guidelines where they first appeared. However, the MUDS Act does require that multi-unit developments, section 19 of the Multi-Unit Development Act requires that an owner's management company provide for long-term replacement refurbishment of an estate. So it has been part of the MUD Act since 2011. And I suppose the answer to that question, the question itself and the answer to it shows the requirement for perhaps joined up thinking and sort of collaboration through all the different stakeholders and participants in the sector. And hopefully this session has delivered some thinking and some food for thought around that particular theme. Another question in is, what key criteria would you advise local authority planners to assess life cycle reports by? Is there any aspect by which life cycle plans currently being produced generally fall short? Mairéad, I might throw that one to you perhaps.
I suppose I deal with building control, but if you look at life cycle reports are very, very complex document to produce. You're looking at the design, the materials that are used in the design, the proposed use, its use in the long and short term of the building, the weather, the location, everything else. So it's actually not just a lot of the documents I see are quite a sparse document. The life cycle report, in my view, would have to take into account the materials, the construction type, the location, the use and the reuse over time. So they're not just a document that one could produce in a very short space of time. They do require an interdisciplinary approach to producing that, where you have your designers, your landscapers, your builders, construction, everything else, and materials. And they, you actually need to even know what materials you're going to use. As I said, zinc has a design life of 60 years, and then a builder may come along and change that roof covering to something that could have it'll keep the water out, but it doesn't have the design life and the recyclability that was intended in the original design. So they actually do need to be assessed by probably a couple of different professions and have an integrated approach to producing them and assessing them.
Thank you for that, Mairéad. We're now 3 minutes over time. We have a vast swathe of questions. We have about 25, 30 questions in. Not possible, I'm afraid, to get to them. One last question, perhaps. Does the Housing Agency envisage any movement towards statutory title for multi-unit developments? Well, we did put up the content of the programme for government, so a matter for our elected representatives there. But there is some indication of review of owners management companies, so that's something to perhaps keep an eye on. Look, we're gone over time. I do want to respect the time of our speakers and our attendees, and for all of you who have stuck with us for that slight overrun. I will perhaps conclude this afternoon's session by conveying my sincere thanks to Mairéad from the NVCO. Thank you very much, Mairéad, for your content and for your availability and for all your support in delivering the session. Thanks indeed to Engineers Ireland, to Sinead Quinn Phillips, to Dee Keogh, to Dave Reardon, to my colleagues Katrina, Mary, Mike and McHale in the background. Thank you all very much for attending this afternoon. Again, please email us mud@housingagency.ie and we'll endeavour to respond to your questions and queries over the next period. With that, I wish you all well. Hope you stay safe and well. Slán agus bana.
Thank you.